So, hallo zusammen und herzlich willkommen mit einem lachenden und einem weinenden Auge zu diesem leider schon letzten Treffen im Rahmen unseres NFTI for Memory Projekts mit dem Germanischen Nationalmuseum, Embodied Interpretathon, Crowdbasierte Interpretation von mittelalterlichen Bewegungsbeschreibungen. Ich freue mich ganz besonders, dass ihr alle heute hier seid und ganz besonders freue ich mich auch, dass ich heute einen Gastredner einführen darf. Wir haben nämlich heute ein Programm, was relativ kurz ist, was meinen Redebeitrag angeht. Ist auch mal schön, dass man die Stimme schonen kann. Ach ja, genau, das hatte ich noch für diejenigen, die es vielleicht noch nicht mitbekommen haben, dass wir vom Germanischen Nationalmuseum gehostet werden und mit dem Deutschen Dachverband für historisches Fechten kooperieren und gleichzeitig mit dem DFG-Projekt der Uni Trier, wo es um die Herausbildung der Kampfbücher im Spätmittelalter als Quellengattung geht. Ähm, Heute aber gibt es tatsächlich für mich nur einen Gastredner anzukündigen, nämlich Dr. Maciej Talaga, der schon bei uns ist. Und es hätte, glaube ich, für mögliche Gastvorträge keinen besseren Kandidaten geben können. Maciej Talaga ist nämlich Anthropologe und Archäologe und hat sich in seiner Doktorarbeit an der Universität Warschau, an der Fakultät Artes Liberales, ganz eingehend und sehr, sehr körperlich mit der Handschrift beschäftigt, die uns heute interessiert, mit der Handschrift 3227a. Er hat sich nämlich ein ganzes Jahr lang einem ja, verkörperten Versuch gewidmet, in dem er versucht hat, diese Fechttechniken und das Fechtsystem, was in der Handschrift beschrieben ist, am eigenen Körper auszuprobieren, sich da sozusagen ganz reinzudenken, sich da ganz reinzufühlen und hat dabei auch protokolliert, was mit seinem Körper passiert ist, als er sich damit auseinandergesetzt hat. Maciej wird selbst noch was zu seiner eigenen Vorstellung sagen. Ich bin zum ersten Mal mit ihm in Kontakt gekommen. Wir haben es gerade schon besprochen. Ich glaube, es war 2017 oder 18, irgendwas in dem Dreh, in einer Facebook-Diskussion, wo ich dachte, oh, das ist spannend, was Maciej zu sagen hat. Ich habe mir sogar Screenshots damals gemacht und ja, jetzt heute, viele Jahre danach, haben wir gemeinsame Projektanträge laufen, haben Ideen zusammen und tatsächlich glaube ich, wäre das Projekt, was ich heute mit euch mache, ohne den Impuls von Maciej so nicht zustande gekommen, weil ich durch die Konfrontation mit seiner Arbeit und durch seine Ideen einfach nochmal anders über Technik und technische Interpretation in der HEMA-Szene nachgedacht habe. Ja, und deswegen schulde ich Maciej ein ganz großes Dankeschön und noch größeres Dankeschön schulde ich ihm, weil er jetzt heute bereit ist, aus seiner Forschung zu berichten. Now I'm going to switch to English. So welcome, Maciej. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I will stop screen sharing and then you can share your presentation and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and for the kind words and the introduction. Hello, everybody. Now I'm alone, but probably at one point my cat will join in, so please bear with her. I also understood that we are here in a somewhat semi-formal situation, so I'll talk a lot, but I think that in case questions arise, don't hesitate to use the raise hand function or otherwise. Let me know that you would have me to clarify something because, well, I've been doing the things that I'll be talking about for quite a long time, meaning that certain things that may be obvious to me are not so obvious to an outsider. So if you feel you're losing the track of my thought, then just let me know. Okay, now I will share the screen and we can proceed with the presentation, and then I assume we'll have plenty of time to discuss. All right, just to confirm, can you see the presentation now? Yeah, great. Okay, so as you can see, the title here is Archaeology of Motion, Matter as an Endospore. And endospore, of course, will be used metaphorically here. I'll try to explain why I think in terms of this metaphor, but I also wanted to highlight at the very beginning that in doing so, I feel that I continue, well, maybe not a tradition, but a method established earlier by Eric, who used fungi and, well, another biological metaphor to talk about the environment, the cultural environment in which fight books emerged. So the very kind of text that will be central to this talk as well. Right. So you already know that I'm an anthropologist and an archaeologist, but my experience in being an anthropologist is much shorter than in being an archaeologist, because I originally started as an archaeologist, doing my master's on like very standard archaeological stuff, such as medieval pins used, to fasten textiles and this kind of stuff. So I feel that I emerge from like proper archaeological background, and I think about myself as an archaeologist. That's why I think about what I do now as a very specific, but still a kind of archaeology, which I call archaeology of motion. I'll try to tell you more about this concept today. Right, so this archaeology of motion was something that was not my original plan, developing this method, but it was something that I gradually grew to need when I tried to bring my interest in historical European martial arts to the next level, because I started, as most people, in HEMA as just an enthusiast, moving from historical reenactment to HEMA study group, there discovering that there are fight books and that they are actually quite interesting texts to read and think about. And well, I spent my whole master's studies at the university trying to figure out if I could somehow combine my archaeological interests with the fight books, and ultimately I failed. So I couldn't do it during my master's studies. But I then thought a lot about this during the 6 years gap between my master's and my doctoral studies, and I managed to successfully pitch a research proposal for my doctoral course, and it was connected specifically to the manuscript 3227A, which is one of the earliest surviving fight books from Europe. And it required me to rethink the philosophy, the methodology behind the then unusual and even awkward idea that things like fencing techniques or generally physical exercise or movement culture in general can be in any way researched or reconstructed in a not textual way. So in a way that was not based just on interpretation of what has been written in the past, but also in a way that engages with these techniques themselves. So the archaeology of motion started as a conceptual project because I wanted to start really methodically reconstruct late medieval movement culture that was preserved in manuscript 3227A. Right, and this, from archaeological perspective, had to be anchored in material artifacts. Okay, so here on the slide you can see a range of material artifacts. Starting from the left, you see clothing. In the middle, there's footwear, and the weapon to the right. And of course, all these things are connected to how a body moves and behaves. Of course, the last thing, the sword, is specifically connected to how a body moves while engaged in fencing or fighting. So now, if we start from the beginning, that is from the standard archaeological perspective, then we can of course say that material artifacts that you see are connected to certain activities. Like the clothing is of course connected to being a person, right? and we can broadly say that it's connected to moving. Footwear is also connected to moving, but it can be more specifically tied to the action of walking and its derivatives like running, jumping, standing, and so forth. And the sword is, of course, connected to fighting. But now, if we want to explore a specific piece of movement culture, in my case, the fighting techniques preserved in manuscript 3227a, then of course we quickly realize that this practice was embedded in all of these material artifacts. So actually, from this perspective, all of these things are also connected to fighting, right? Because fighting is a kind of body movement, and body movement is affected by footwear and by clothing and also by other things. Now, but the thing is that if we stop here, and most archaeologists do stop here, then we end up with a very, very broad conclusion that these material artifacts are connected to fighting, which doesn't actually tell us much. It's not very useful realization. In order to step deeper, we need what we can call a finer granulation or just better precision. This is why I started to consider that perhaps there is a methodical way to research motions rather than like practices, because we can think about fighting as a practice, but this practice has its components. It's built of certain elements, and these elements are particular motions, they're sequences. So, so the things that we colloquially can call techniques and tactics, for instance, or strategies, right? So my first idea was to find a way to begin from the very bottom, that is from the elements of which the practice is composed, that is the motions. Now, and this brings us to something, a concept that I want to introduce, but in order to make it easier to grasp, I'll start not with medieval stuff, but with something that we can more easily understand today. And now what you can see on the slide, of course, is a smartphone. And smartphone is, of course, a material artifact. Now, what you see next to it is a body posture. That's like pretty commonly seen today. Well, up to the extent that for many physiotherapists or medical professionals, it is a recognizable, well, maybe not illness, but some kind of pathology, with some professionals even expressing concerns about what they call an epidemic of this kind of posture, which has its consequences for the body and also even generally for health, including mental health. Now, and if we look at this from the archaeological perspective, then the smartphone is the material artifact, and this body posture may be called a kinetic artifact that is tied to this material artifact. And it's not a practice, it's a specific posture. So we can say it's a specific motion or an element of a wider practice. Here we could, for instance, call this practice scrolling on the phone, or we can go upwards and think of it being a part of an even larger practice. But what's undeniable is that this practice is built from, among other elements, also from this kind of posture or this kinetic artifact. And now, if we stay with the concept of kinetic artifacts, then we can characterize them with like 4 recurring distinguishing features. And the first feature is that kinetic artifacts, unlike material artifacts that we can just grasp, or if we are archaeologists, we can dig them up, unearth them, and hold in our hands, watch, rotate, etc. Kinetic artifacts have ephemeral materiality, because motion is material. When someone punches you in the face, like the materiality is like really, really easy to feel. But it's also ephemeral because the motion is only material as long as it is happening. When it stops, it is no more. Its materiality is gone. But then, despite this ephemeral materiality, kinetic artifacts can still produce tangible and lasting changes in physical bodies that can be traced, right? Especially if the kinetic artifact is sort of practiced repeatedly or sustained for long enough. Now, the second feature is that kinetic artifacts are co-created by the material and social affordances, or the, constraints and opportunities created by these two domains. That is, by the materiality involved in a given practice and the social reception of this practice, social drivers and other social factors or social cultural factors affecting it. The third feature is that kinetic artifacts can be designed or created deliberately when we design material artifacts to specifically enable or elicit or provoke certain motions, but they can also emerge spontaneously in an unplanned way as a side effect of the materiality of the material artifact. Right, and here we can say that it is an example of this, but I'll get back to it later. Now, and the fourth feature is that kinetic artifacts, just as any other artifact, they bear meanings in their cultural contexts. So they are not meaningless. Now, and this particular kinetic artifact that we are using as an example is often called the smartphone neck in English. And now, if we look at it from the perspective of these distinguishing features, we can see that it actually checks all four. First of all, people do not assume this posture all the time, right? So this posture is ephemeral in this sense, but it still produces lasting changes in the musculoskeletal system, affecting health, affecting body posture, how the joints and bones develop, and that's why it is a matter of concern for medical professionals. Secondly, it is co-created by the materiality of smartphones, which are small devices, handheld, with haptic screens that also need to be held at specific angles to provide optimal visibility, etc., etc., and also by cultural or social affordances or factors, because the extent to which people use smartphones is conditioned by the culturally driven desire to use them, simply because so much interesting stuff is either only accessible through smartphones or easiest to access through smartphones. Now, thirdly, the smartphone neck was neither designed nor desired by the creators of smartphones and their users. It's something that just emerged through from the interaction between the materiality and the affordances of smartphones, the social affordances of smartphones, and the materiality of human body and what it affords. And lastly, having a smartphone neck, right, or performing smartphone neck is something that is not entirely devoid of cultural meanings, because it may communicate lifestyle choices if it becomes like habitual and the body posture becomes really affected by it, in turn then affecting social perception of a person, or in some cases also perception of the self, right? So as we can see, this is like a proper kinetic artifact if we understand it as I proposed earlier. Now, and especially because of the cultural meanings of kinetic artifacts, they can be considered what Bruno Latour would call matters of concern. That these those shared observations, shared commitments, shared considerations and orientations that bring people together and create communities, right? And as I mentioned earlier, smartphone ec is already a matter of concern for physical therapists, for medical professionals, for teachers, as well as users, right? Of course, not all of them, but quite a lot. Now, so I think that we now all are on the same page regarding what a kinetic artifact is and how it connects to material artifacts. But let me stress again that the problem from an archaeological perspective is that kinetic artifacts are ephemeral, right? They cannot be excavated. And when the body stops, when the movement stops, they will vanish, just like tears in the rain. And that's a major problem. Now, so in order to overcome this difficulty, I started thinking about alternative, non-standard archaeological approaches to investigating kinetic artifacts that would be, in a way, inspired by the archaeological method of dealing with material artifacts, but also able to, well, deal with this basic difficulty. So in order to help you grasp the idea, let's now use the cenotaph metaphor. Okay, so the standard archaeological way of thinking about material artifacts, even when they are considered as something that reflects embodied practices, can be a cenotaph, the cenotaph metaphor. Because normally archaeologists use material artifacts as a window to think about culture. So they make a conceptual leap from the material thing, right, that they excavated, for instance, or found in a museum, to the culture that created this. So the material relic is like a fossil or just a specter of past practices. These past practices are in no way accessible unless through interpretation of the material relic, right? So the standard way to approach material artifacts is to see them as texts, and these texts need to be interpreted, right? So we can say that this way of looking, the cenotaph way of looking at material relics, provides descriptive information. That is information about what happened in the past, about what existed in the past, and through interpretation, about what meanings were attached to the things that existed. But it offers no room to recreate what is forever lost, seemingly forever lost. And among these things is the ephemeral motion, right? So I knew after some consideration that I cannot apply this way of thinking because that would be hopeless. That would mean that there is no way to actually access the kinetic artifacts. So I needed something else. Now, and in order to grasp the possibility that is there, let's now imagine a medieval person that's given a smartphone, like magically, right? And of course, let's assume that the smartphone is fully functional. So it can do all the texting, all the scrolling, all the social media, etc., right? So now we have this person, and now let's imagine that this person gets really interested in this device, like many users today, and spends quite a lot of time like scrolling using it. Do you think, if left with smartphone for long enough, this medieval knight portrayed here would develop a smartphone neck eventually? Right? I don't need your answer now, but let's use it as a thought experiment, right? Of course, there are many intervening factors. that could affect the final outcome, but in principle, this is a possibility, right? So if that is the case, if we theoretically could produce a modern kinetic artifact in a medieval person by exposing them to the affordances of a specific modern material artifact, then perhaps the opposite is also true. That is, perhaps by taking a modern person and exposing it to the affordances of material relics from the past, we could recreate, or at least approximate, a past kinetic artifact. Right? So this is the basic line of reasoning that I assumed in my developing of the concept of archaeology of motion. Now, and of course, this is based on like quite a lot of philosophical thinking, and I don't want to go through all of this today because that would be too long and actually quite boring. But I want to highlight several key concepts. And well, in developing archaeology of motion, I owe quite a lot to what's often called the new materialism, and it's a different way of thinking about materiality, including material objects and or things. And it hasn't been developed in archaeology, but it has been taken up in archaeology. Well, quite early, and I would even argue that archaeology might have been the first academic discipline to, well, give it a proper methodological consideration, and also the first one to try to apply it to its own doings. With like the most notable pioneer there being Bjarnar Olsen, a Norwegian archaeologist who was, well, the first one to really actively try to champion this through a series of polemic articles, like more than 2 decades ago. Right, so here is a quote from another notable archaeologist, Christopher Whitmore, and he says, "The new materialisms challenge archaeologists not to see cobbled surfaces as mundane backdrops to the real events of life, not to peer through multiple layers of plaster for a deeper reality of household renewal, not to look beyond the pot, the owl, or a stone enclosure for explanations concerning the reasons for their existence. They challenge us not to probe the alleged transcendent realms of culture, subjectivity, or meaning for answers to why things are. All entities are participants within their own emergence." This is a bit dense, but to unpack it quickly, what he tries to say is that things are not just like things, material objects, artifacts, are not just cenotaphs, are not just something created by culture and now unearthed by archaeologists during excavations as a fossil or a specter or a text to be interpreted. It's not just something that was created from the top down, but new materialists propose to see things as co-creators of culture, right? So cultures are dynamic systems that are never static, that are constantly becoming. And the things that cultures undeniably produce are also, well, among the elements that create the cultures as well, right? So it's like a constant mutual feedback loop between things, people, and the societies that they create, right? And these societies and the people and the things are always becoming. They are never fully like realized. Okay, now it's a little break to let in my cat. Sorry for that, but as if there are cat owners among you, know that the cat is always on the wrong side of the door, so we're gonna have this interactions probably. a few times during this speech. Right, so now, if we now turn to one of the godmothers of new materialism, Karen Barad, she also notes that one of these material, artifacts is also the human body. And the human body is the vehicle, so to say, through which people experience the world. But it's not external. It's not external to the world. It's not external to culture as well, right? Because bodies also participate in the process of becoming. So they become together with the cultures, and the cultures become because there are bodies and becoming bodies, that is. Right? So that's why she says we are not our bodies as our bodies. We are not in the world, but we are part of the world in the process of becoming. Now, and this is important because if something is in the process of becoming, it means that it moves from a past state to a future one. And the future one, of course, can be partly determined by different kind of constraints. But, well, ultimately, if we look at the very bottom, the base of it, all becoming is motivated by desire, right? People desire certain futures. And this desire drives them to try achieve things in the material world. And the material world might either support their attempts to realize their desires or may resist them. But desire is still there, right? So becoming is moving from what was to what is sought. And now, because of this movement, becoming is not only shaped by the desire, that is the projected future, but it is also determined partly by the past state, by what was, right? And what was provides another set of constraints that affects what parts of the desired future can be actually realized by a person or by a society, right? So this past constraints can be conceptualized as furrows or paths in a rugged, difficult terrain, or what is otherwise known in philosophy as path dependence. Right, so if we look at this graph that discusses the concept of path dependence, we see that it's actually a furrow, because when we try to do things, when we start, we have some project, some desire to achieve, accomplish. The possibilities at the very onset are, very wide. But as we go, we start to encounter constraints, be it material constraints or social constraints, right? And by choosing this or that path to deal with these constraints, we open certain possibilities, but we also must exclude other possibilities. And when we continue this process over time, the furrow grows narrower and narrower until it becomes a pretty thin path, right? So path dependence will mean that similar desires realized in similar environments will often end up following similar paths. Path dependence is the process that is behind, for instance, what biologists call convergent evolution. That is the process that leads to very different organisms developing very similar physical traits because they exist in a similar environment and also follow similar lifestyles. Think whales or dolphins and sharks, right? They are not identical, but they are morphologically quite similar, although whales are mammals and sharks are fish, right? And you name it, there are many examples of this in nature. right? So this shows the power of path dependence, as well as the power of desire in shaping the process of becoming. But also it shows that the process of becoming can sometimes be, well, predictable, not entirely determined, but predictable to a certain extent. Now, and this idea, when I started preparing my dissertation, I thought this concept is like really, really new. And I was really happy because of this. But then I discovered that there are already scholars who are following a similar train of thought. One of them being Otto Sebum, who develops his own thing, which he calls experimental history of science. And now I wanted to use an excerpt from one of his works to illustrate how this concept can be used, which is basically a new materialist concept, can be used to investigate the past, and in Sebum's case, early modern, or well, yeah, let's say post-medieval, early modern proto-scientific experiments, or experiments of pioneers of the scientific revolution, right? So what Sebum does, he works with textual sources in the form of experimental protocols drawn by these proto-scientists or early scientists, like Jacques Joule, for instance. And he also creates with his team very accurate replicas, or even in some cases uses the actual mechanical devices used during these experiments, right? And there he has an opportunity by replicating the experiments according to the protocols, using the replicas of experimental devices. He sort of can experience the resistance of matter, so to say, resistance of these material objects to what's described in the texts. And he convincingly shows interesting findings, not always, but sometimes. And here is an excerpt from his replication of the experiment, like physical experiments by Jacques Joule with the device that you see on the slide. And it can be conceptualized as a dialogue between what's written in the protocol and what the device actually affords, right? And as Sebum himself wrote, performing the experiment led to the insight that the choreography of actions derived from the publication, he means the original publication by Jacques Joule, did not harmonize with the course of action experienced with the replica. That's first observation. Now, let's go further, right? So the matter starts to resist, but it resists further. Even the sense economy of the experimenter alone demanded the carrying out of simultaneous working rhythms. An assistant, unnamed in the text, was necessary to manage the mechanical operation of the instrument, right? So we start to see cracks in the official publication, based on which, like we today use joule as a unit of measurement, right? And Otto Sebum further notes that these experience differences between textual and performative coherence of experimental actions was most annoying, but at the same time the source of new discoveries, including, as he noted at the conclusion of the paper, that there must have been at least one another person helping Joule that's never mentioned in the experimental protocol, and sort of because of this made invisible to historians, but rediscovered or made visible again by Sebum's experimental history of science. Right, so it was, Sebum doesn't claim there to reconstruct what really happened. He can't claim to actually do exactly what Joule did, right? In fact, he couldn't do exactly what Joule wrote he did, because Joule omitted important details that become apparent only through interaction with the replica and trying to replicate the effects of the experiment, right? So this kind of approach is not about recreating past events. It's not about recreating past persons, but it certainly is an epistemic act. That is, it provides knowledge about the past, and sometimes perhaps knowledge that was possessed by people in the past, right? And now, if we, but of course, Sibum is not interested in kinetic artifacts, right? He's interested in science and knowledge and this kind of stuff, right? So if we want to take this approach back to what I'm interested in, that is the bodily motion, the kinetic artifacts, then we need to think further. And this thinking is very much assisted by the great book by Ben Spatz called What a Body Can Do. You can see it on the slide, and I can't recommend it enough. What Spatz does there is he provides a very robust and useful framework that allows one to think about motions as epistemic objects, not just physical actions, but like pieces of knowledge mobilized in a way, right? And he introduces two important concepts. He creates his own understanding of the term technique and his own understanding of the term practice, right? And as he writes, technique, I argue, differs from related concepts like performativity and habitus in that it emphasizes the epistemic dimension of practice. Embodied technique then refers to transmissible and repeatable knowledge, knowledge of relatively reliable possibilities afforded by human embodiment. Unlike those other terms, technique emphasizes conscious as well as unconscious repetition and provides a model for how these relate to each other. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. To each other through the sedimentation and circulation of agency. Now, again, to unpack this, what Ben proposes here is that if we think of motion happening in real time, what we are seeing, what we are perceiving is practice. That is a specific instance or a specific manifestation of motion. But the fact that we can repeat the same motion over and over, one day, then the other day, etc., or that different people can be seen to do the same thing, is possible because there is technique. And technique is the knowledge that allows people to create practice, right? And Ben Spatz himself uses a nice culinary metaphor for this. So if you think about a dish, well, say pizza, because everyone knows pizza and most people like it. So if you have pizza, let's say pizza pepperoni, then the fact that you and me can cook pizza pepperoni is because we are following the same recipe, right? So while each of these pizzas will be a bit different, even if we follow exactly the same recipe, then meaning that our practice differs in details, it is still guided by the same technique or by the same knowledge of certain reliabilities in the materiality of pizza and materiality of kitchen utensils and materiality of our bodies, etc. Right? So this is Spatz's understanding of practice and technique. And this means that if we think about kinetic artifacts and trying to access them through material artifacts, we should not think that we are going to, repeat what happened. We can never repeat a motion performed by another person. If I'm tying shoes today and tomorrow, it's the same technique, but each time the motion will be a bit different, right? So I can't even repeat myself in absolute terms, much less repeat what a medieval person did, right? So we can't repeat practice. But what we can access is technique. That is the epistemic content of kinetic artifacts, right? So this is an important consideration, because this means that even while using archaeology of motion, we can't claim to repeat something that happened in the past, but we still can learn a lot about what these people knew and well, expand our knowledge about the past this way. Right, now I use this approach before delving into medieval stuff. I use this approach, or the early version of this approach, for something easier, because I investigate an almost extinct folk tradition, specifically folk wrestling style from rural Poland. That's, well, it's called biady, but it's not important here. What's important here is that this style is represented by a handful of elderly practitioners who are too old to perform it, basically. But they can, to an extent, they can talk about it. So we started doing interviews with these men. But it turned out that being like simple persons from the rural background, most of them lacked, I mean, all of them lacked the technolect, like the jargon, the language to speak about something as complicated as wrestling technique. So at first the thing seemed hopeless, but then we decided that perhaps there's a way to actually access this, their memories, their embodied memories. So what we did is we gathered the very limited accounts that we had from the interviews, like traditional interviews. Then we spent a few months in the club. I'm talking we, that is me and my friends from the HEMO club. And we started training ourselves in like a very naive reconstruction that we could, design based on the limited accounts that we had. And now with these rough, naive reconstructions, we went back to the witnesses. And instead of questioning them further, we just asked them to watch us perform our reconstructions. And this was a great workaround for their linguistic deficits, because instead of talking about it, they could just, push, for instance, our hips in the right place or readjust our holds. And generally, they could use bodies instead of language to help us and guide us towards the technique that they had in mind. And then we used the information we got there to get back to training for a couple months, then we returned, and it was an iterative process that in the end, in the course of 6 years, resulted in a catalog of techniques that we had confirmed from various witnesses and developed. And as you see, this is a GIF showing one example of us performing stuff in front of one of the witnesses, and in this case, it's my late grandpa. Right, so we could perform in front of them, and then they would give us feedback either by as you can see, we also filmed it from a few angles because it was important for us also to film the expressions of the face, hear the remarks that were given by them while we practiced, which we couldn't hear because we were busy wrestling, for instance, right? So in this case, we had an efficiently lost practice because no one could actually show us how to do it, like demonstrate it. But through engagement with the materiality of this practice and the textual verbal instructions that we had, we could gradually approximate the things that our witnesses had in mind, right? So now this was possible, and because we had these witnesses. Of course, when we are dealing with stuff that's mediated only through texts from the Middle Ages, it's much more difficult. Because if you look at the graph above, I'm not sure, can you see my pointer now? Is it visible on the screen, what I'm pointing at or not? Yeah, okay. Because now the problem is, if we want to explore past, well, technique, right? But the past technique derives from past practice. The motions that actually happened, right? It was structured by some past technique. And if we are lucky, and we are lucky with fight books, this technique is then preserved in not only artifacts like swords, but also in recipes, that is fight books, right? But the creation of the artifact that preserves embodied technique is not straightforward. And it's of course mediated by culture, right? So the past culture. And then when we lay our hands on it, we try to, infer the technique from these recipes and artifacts, but our inference is mediated by our culture. And then when we try to use this technique to create modern practice, it's again mediated by our culture. So we are like thrice removed from the technique and even farther from the practice. But there is hope, because what connects this practice and this practice, that is past practice and present practice, circumvents most of this cultural mediation, because our practice and their practice was still constrained by very similar and sometimes identical material constraints, such as the laws of physics, like inherent qualities of material things involved in these practices, as well as such stuff as physiology of the human body, which is not unchanged in time, but it changes pretty slowly. And especially if we're talking about the Middle Ages, there are good reasons to believe that our physiology is like very, very, very similar to their physiology in terms of basic functions, right? So we can call this latent structure or the landscape of affordances, right? So the bundle of constraints that that shaped both their practice and our practice. So we actually have quite a lot in common, despite the cultural divide, right? Of course, this is based on spots, but it's also based on concepts that were coined by so-called ecological psychologists. Here, the latent structure is specifically borrowed from Harry Heft, but generally the school of thinking is connected to a psychologist named James Gibson. I won't delve there too much, but I'm open to questions later. Okay, so we see that there is this this connection here. Now, and this connection is what opens the possibility that the smartphone can create this smartphone neck in a medieval night, and that perhaps medieval artifacts or medieval landscape of affordances can create medieval kinetic artifacts in a modern body, at least to some extent. And now, I wanted to move on from there to show you an example of this being used based on my findings from like applying archaeology of motion to the manuscript 3227A. But before we proceed with the example, just a quick clarification. When I applied archaeology of motion to manuscript 3227A, I used it as the recipe, right? So if we get back to the previous slide, here is manuscript 3227A. But in order to recreate the landscape of affordances, so to create this connection, I couldn't rely just on the fact that my body is perhaps similar to the body of a medieval person in its basic functions. But I wanted also, I had to surround myself with artifacts, right? So I needed to make sure that my body meets as much of the material constraints and possibilities created by medieval artifacts as possible, right? So I had to really locate precisely the recipe in a material world, meaning that I had to establish its dating, its socio-cultural context, and then working from there, I had to establish what kind of artifacts were needed for the practices that I wanted to investigate, and then I had to obtain like faithful replicas of these artifacts and use them in my research. And now, the important thing about applying archaeology of motion is that this latent structure of landscape of affordances provided by material artifacts, it won't affect your body in a day or nor in a week, right? If you start dressing as a medieval person and walking in medieval shoes or swinging a sword, it won't do much to your body if you do it for a short period of time, right? So in order to let the landscape of affordances affect your process of becoming, then you need to give it enough time. In my case, it was 12 months of structured daily research. Okay, so keep this in mind. We'll probably get back to it towards the end of the presentation. And now let's get back to the finding. One of the things that I discussed in the doctoral thesis was well, a bunch of kinetic artifacts, and one of them was how people walked, because there is some research on that, and most notably there is a recognized expert on medieval footwear, Markita Volken, an archaeologist, and she proposed that in the late Middle Ages, and well, in the Middle Ages, before a certain point in the late Middle Ages, people would walk differently than what we consider the norm today. And her argument is that today people, the natural gait for people in the Western or industrialized world is the heel strike. That is, when walking, we put heels first on the ground and then roll the foot to make a step, etc. While in the Middle Ages, her argument goes, they would walk with what she calls a forefoot gait or forefoot strike. That is, they would rather connect first with the ball of the foot, the front part, and walk this way. This is an image from her article showing what she meant, and also these little stars show how this affects the load on the body or the forces that are being applied during stepping. Right, so her argument goes as follows. The types and methods of construction for shoes, associated patterns, and repair soles are a technological response to the variety of ground encountered at the time. During the 15th century, most roads were natural beaten earth, sometimes paved with wood or gravel. Concerns with sanitation in cities introduced street paving in the form of cobblestones or bricks, which became widespread by the end of the 15th century. The change in the walking surfaces had an immense impact on the types of shoes being produced and, by extension, the manner in which people walked. And then somewhat later, she says, these developments also changed the manner in which Western people walked. The protected heel area on the shoe allowed a heel strike method of walking, which is now considered as normal. She means that more towards the early medieval period, shoes started to having like actually reinforced heels, and this allowed people to start using the heel strike. But before the abrupt and consequential changes of the end of the 15th century, the forefoot strike, the natural gait for humans, was prevalent. So if we assume she's right, the forefoot gait would be a kinetic artifact, right? A specific motion that, well, reportedly characterized, the life of medieval persons. And now, if we have a look at the archaeological shoes, we'll see that, well, first of all, we don't have too many soles preserved with the signs of use, but we have a bunch. And if we look at them, and the archaeological ones are A and B on the picture, they show like heavy wear on both the ball, the front part of the foot, the shoe, and the heel, suggesting that like both sides were used for walking. Now, when I was doing my 12 months of like archaeology of motion, I walked daily in medieval shoes. I even walked my kids to the kindergarten this way. I did all my fighting, all my exercises, all my running, all my weightlifting, gardening, you name it, in medieval shoes. And I deliberately, well, did not impose any specific gait on me. I just moved in a way that felt right. And now, over the period of these 12 months, my replica shoes developed a very similar wear pattern to what we observe on medieval shoes, suggesting that perhaps what Vulcan presents as a kinetic artifact was not exactly this. Also, if we look at the iconography, here is of course an example from Tachelfer. It's also quite inconclusive, because we see postures like on the right where you could argue that it's something akin to the 4-foot gait. We also have like depictions of this in fighting, but in fighting we also commonly see what arguably may be interpreted as showing the heel strike. So perhaps the use of one or the other gait was rather contextual. Also, in broader iconography, we can see, like for instance, a clear pattern that runners are routinely presented running on the front of their feet, while other people not so much. So, like initially, it seems that Vulcan's conclusion may be too strong, and we can't actually, see 4-foot gait as a kinetic artifact at all. But then again, because I was working in a specific recipe, and this recipe is about fighting and a specific method of fighting, it's guided by certain principles advocated by the author of the manuscript. And one of the leading principles is what he calls Mose, which is usually translated either as measure or moderation. And he, evokes this concept numerous times across the book, and many times in connection to footwork. And here's a quote from the manuscript that admonishes us, or the fencers, to be certain in their steps, and also to make sure that these steps are measured correctly, so that they are neither too long nor too short. Right, and if you apply this kind of instruction to the dynamic practice, and also an agonistic or antagonistic practice that is fencing or fighting in general, then it's tricky because you need to move quickly and decisively, often courageously, and suddenly in response to threats or opportunities that emerge dynamically during the encounter. But you are also instructed to do it in a measured way, in a precise way. And now, again, I did not try to use any specific gate for this, as I told you, but if you look here, this is a clip from a movie that I prepared as part of the documentation for my project, and it shows my lunging technique at the onset of the project. This is the lunging technique as you see in modern shoes, and this is what I've been taught as a fencer, not only in HEMA, but also, and probably actually primarily in my days as an Olympic épée fencer, right? So it's a technique where I land on the heel, use the traction of the soles and the traction of the floor to provide the grip that's necessary to stop the motion and then proceed with other motions. And then when I did a similar documentation at the end of the project, I noticed, and only then noticed, that although I thought I'm doing the same thing, because to give it context, many HEMA people argue that you can't lunge in historical shoes, that it's too dangerous and you would just fall over on grass or sand or whatever. And I took this remark seriously and gave it quite some consideration during my research. And what I found was that at the beginning, it seemed to me that it's perfectly right, because when I tried to lunge in historical shoes at the beginning of the project, it was usually catastrophic. It was very hard. I would have to either do it really, really slow in a way that was not applicable to actual combat, or I would risk slipping or falling. But as time went by, I kept practicing, this effect of the footwear started to diminish. So I was really happy to see later in the project that I actually regained my ability to do lunges, this time in historical footwear, in a dynamic and efficient way. And I thought that I somewhat just, adjusted to the shoes, and that my technique remained the same. But when I filmed myself, I discovered that actually the reason why this started working was that my body changed the technique. It was not a deliberate process. It was something that emerged in the process of becoming and in the landscape of medieval affordances. And as you can see, I land differently on the video in a way that compensates for the fact that the leather sole is much more slippery than a rubber one. But also landing this way like exponentially increases the traction area. So it helps a lot in get a secure landing despite a dynamic application of force that is required for an efficient lunge, right? So, excuse me. So, wait a sec. So this can be considered a kinetic artifact that emerged through my my process of becoming in this landscape of affordances. And now I'll use this to explore how this kinetic artifact, which may seem minor and actually not very significant, translates to like thinking about broader culture. Now, this is an example of me overcommitting, right? So that was not a proper measured lunge. It was done in a competition, in the heat of battle. I got overexcited, and this is what happens when you do it wrong. So that was not according to the recipe, right? But here is another example. Bam. This is also not a measured step, and it's not and this one is measured better, right? And this measure is not only about retaining the ability to change direction, but it's even more so about proper distance, right? So measure can be rhythmic. That is, like in this case, in the previous case, there was lack of measure because the rhythm of motion and the extent of motion was too much for the material artifacts to actually support. Here in the first one, the distance, so the length of the step was too much because I landed too close to the opponent to be able to react to their threat, which was corrected in the second example. So this is another kinetic artifact connected to the concept of measure, right? Here another one. This is a counterattack that requires proper distance management. So not stepping too long or too short as per the instruction, the recipe that is in manuscript 3227A, right? Step too close or too far, this technique won't work because you'll either have the bad angle and won't be able to stop the incoming strike, or you won't connect with the thrust, thus not stopping the attack at all, right? So now if we take these practical observations back to the recipe, we see that again, the fight book wants us to want our steps to be measured, gemessen, right? Which is of course a derivative of Mosse or Masse in Middle High German. And as Johannes Rotte, the author of Ritterspiegel, tells us, measure is the matter of all virtue, right? And if we trace how the word Mosse was used in period, we'll see that it's used primarily as an ethical, or as an ethical term, connected to how people behave, how they live generally. And what's important, it was by maintaining moderation that a person was taught to uphold the divine order of the world, meaning that if we read medieval German didactic literature, we can see Mosse as a concept that was designed by the clergy to sort of discipline the, well, the other estates, right? So the rest of the medieval society as something that can be seen as going from the top, from the thinkers, from the spiritual leaders to the masses, including the knights, in an attempt to discipline them in the Foucaultian sense. But, well, this corresponds interestingly to another part of the manuscript, where we are told that in all fencing, we shouldn't rely too much upon the art and have the highest rightus fencer, that is God, in our mind's eye, so that he might protect us in our art, and we should practice our art only for emergencies in the right way, and not for nothing, not for vain, and not out of foolishness, so we may always succeed, because a fencer should be a good man. Paraphrasing, right? This shows that for the author of manuscript 3227a, Mosse was both an ethical virtue, but also a very practical consideration. So by looking at it this way, through the material and embodied examples that I showed you, it becomes clear that to the author of the manuscript 3227a, in order to win a fight, you had to have the help of God. So you had to be a good person, because bad people would eventually be punished by God and lose. So being an ethical person was part of being an efficient martial artist. And since being moderate or measured was part of being a good person, that is winning God's favor, then we could see this concept of measure as something that goes from the top, from the broader culture, and something that influences the writing from above. So that would be a top-down view on Mosse in manuscript 3227a. But by exploring the embodied examples, we show that at the same time, it was a practical fighting principle, something that in very practical ways affected combat efficiency. So here we see that these two views are not mutually exclusive, but actually they harmonize together. By being measured and moderate in your fighting, you were not only like practically efficient, but you were also upholding the divine order, winning God's favor, and then being even more efficient in your fighting because of the divine protection. Now, another example can be another kinetic artifact that in the manuscript is called Ortschießen, that is shooting the point. Here are examples of this being applied, and interestingly, this motion is a sword action that has it plays several functions, but one of its most prominent function is that it can stop an incoming attack that is not extended enough, like in this case, where the opponent's arms are bent when they begin the attack by disengaging, which the manuscript calls durchwechseln. And Schießen defeats it because it reaches the opponent earlier than they can reach us, and thus stops them in their track. And now embodied exploration of this showed that out of the multiple ways to perform the action, there is just a very tiny, narrow path that actually affords achieving the result that's described in the recipe, right? So out of the many hypothetical Schießen versions that you could imagine, only a small fraction was actually efficient, and they all grouped within a narrow path, and this path is marked in red here, right? So this shows the latent geometry of the action, right? If we raise the sword up, like this green circle shows, like especially this part of the circle shows where the human arms attached at the shoulder can reach, right? And the sword is by necessity held by the hands that are at the end of this arc. So then it must extend from there. So if the sword is held high, it doesn't reach the outer perimeter of the blue circle. If it's held low, the same happens. In order to achieve the reach that affords doing what Shisen is supposed to afford, you need to make sure that your sword goes somewhere along this path, right? So we can see that, well, this kind of material constraints provided by the artifacts, as well as the dynamic interaction of two bodies fighting, create this furrow that leads us to medieval technique. And now, if Shisen is a kinetic artifact, then it brings us to a cultural artifact in the form of latent geometry, geometry of action. So again, it lets us see that the things that might not have been openly discussed by medieval fencers, that is geometry that begins being really discussed later, especially in the 16th century, were not unknown. Perhaps they just lacked language or lacked explicit, interest or desire to discuss these things, but they were still aware.
Maciej, I hate to interrupt, but it's already 9:20. There will be many questions. So
shit. Okay, fine. So that is just the end. So this allows us to ask a question. If artisanal literature, as was shown by Pamela Smith, for instance, was the crucible of scientific revolution, providing ideas and testing them, then perhaps so were the fight books, right? So it shows how kinetic artifacts bring us to the broader stuff of cultural studies. Okay, and finally, the endospore metaphor. So by approaching the material artifacts this way, we can see that if we take material relics, plus material bodies, plus enough time, then material artifacts can act not as endospores, not as cenotaphs of past practices, but rather as endospores. That is, things that can initiate processes of becoming in the present people, or processes of becoming dormant, but that can be lived or experienced, right? So we can then move from descriptive information to generative information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maciej. This was a deep dive into your research. Highly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I lost the track of time.
No problem, no problem. I mean, you are our esteemed speaker, so you are allowed to go a little longer. So, but I'm sure there will be many questions, and feel free to ask them. If you're having trouble translating your question from German to English, we will be happy to help. And yeah, questions, please. You can raise your hand, or you can just give me a sign.